Right, I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. So hello and a very sincere welcome here to Glucksman Ireland House. I am Sarah Wadler. I'm a faculty member here at the House, and I focus on the medieval Irish world, and I've worked on various digital humanities projects, including digitization of medieval Irish materials. And I'm here tonight to introduce a project that's a little bit later than that, but I think which has a massive groundbreaking initiative that I suspect is going to have a huge impact on digital projects across the humanities and certainly within Ireland and within Irish America. The project that we are here to discuss tonight focuses on the Brooklyn Publish An Gaodhal newspaper, which ran from 1881 until 1904 in its original form. And it is the first newspaper in the world, I think I just should pause there with that, that it is the first newspaper in the world published predominantly in the Irish language. The project seeks to transform previously digitized images into machine-readable text using OCR technology. The resulting extracted text files will then be able to form the basis of a searchable interface and can be used for text mining and analysis, and will reveal the rich cultural world of Irish-speaking Irish America in New York in the late 19th century. Now, this is an incredibly exciting project that has so much to give to the Irish community in America and indeed to Ireland as well. And to discuss this project tonight, we have two of the people that have been behind this wonderful initiative for a good number of years, I believe. So first, to introduce Nicholas Wolfe, who holds dual appointments as the Associate Director for Research and Publishing Initiatives in Glucksman Ireland House and the co-head of Data Services just at our neighbour in NYU Libraries. He is the author of An Irish-Speaking Island, published by the University of Wisconsin Press in 2014, which is a social and culture history of Ireland's Irish language community in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was awarded the Michael J. Durkin Prize for Books on Language and Culture and the Donald Murphy Prize for Distinguished First Books by the American Conference for Irish Studies. His research into the social and cultural history of the Irish language, Irish Catholicism, and Ireland's population history has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, New York University's Digital Humanities Seed Grant, and University Research Challenge Fund, the Newberry Library, and the Newman College at the University of Melbourne. Our other speaker is Deirdre Ní Chonghaile, who is a writer, musician, broadcaster, and curator for the Aran Islands, County Galway. She works with artists, communities, and institutions on cultural heritage projects, specializing in Irish language and music archives. Her 2021 monograph, which also won the Michael J. Durkin Prize for Books on Language and Culture from the American Conference for Irish Studies. I think we're seeing a theme here. Great writers winning great prizes. Is entitled Collecting Music in the Aran Islands, A Century of History and Practice, and has been described as one of the most important and fascinating books about Irish traditional music in recent memory. And indeed, if you're in Ireland this spring, I would also highly recommend that you view her exhibition on the pioneering Irish language scholar, newspaper editor, and folklore collector, Professor Tomás O'Malley, which was previously running at the Royal Irish Academy and is now in Cornamona. I'm now going to hand over to Nicholas Wolfe, who will take you through the beginnings of From Galway to Brooklyn, creating a digital edition of An Gaodhal, the world's first Irish language newspaper.
Welcome. I promise this wasn't an attempt at a Durkin Prize reunion, but it is nice to have us both in the room, I think. My thanks tonight to Mary Elizabeth, to Fanta, and to Khadija, our staff here at Glucksman Ireland House, for helping us host an evening here tonight and talk about this project that we're very excited about. Now, the goal of this project is manyfold, but starts with the aim of turning into machine-readable text the digitized images of a monthly newspaper called An Gaodhal, first published in 1881, as we mentioned, that was established, printed, and distributed out of our own Brooklyn borough here. by the Irish immigrant and fierce proponent of the Irish language, Mícheál Ullachán. Now, this wasn't just any Irish-American newspaper. Obviously, it's part of the so-called ethnic newspaper, the ethnic press, right, that was common at the time. But as we mentioned, this is the first newspaper in the world published predominantly in Irish, which was kind of a natural extension of, as you'll hear later from Deirdre, the growing number of Gaelic department columns and Irish language columns that had been published in the newspapers of the 19th century. And it's also a precursor to also better known, I would say, newspapers that were founded in Ireland in the subsequent years, Irish Leabhar na Gaeilge and An Clive Solish being the most notable ones that you'll encounter. So we'll hear more about this in a few minutes. Other little tiny details about this project to mention is that the print collection of An Gaodhal that we're working from is held at the Special Collections, Hardiman Library at the University of Galway. And as far as we can determine, this is the most complete print set still extant in the archives, hence our focus on using that particular print collection as the basis of first the digitization, and now the step we're working on now is, as we said, the text extraction. Still more unique, this collection here at the University of Galway contains marginalia by the previous owner, Reverend Daniel Murphy, which points to further kind of hidden aspects of this print collection. He talks about potential sources for some of the songs and poems, and just makes little annotations that we want to include in the eventual output of this work as a way of further elucidating the contents of this particular newspaper. Now, as I've said, we're trying to turn these photographed pages of the newspaper into a set of computer files, really, that can form the basis for a search interface, enrich the metadata of their home on the Hardiman Library's digital library site, where you can actually find them already, but without some of the full details that we're aiming to produce. And we'd like to start the process of identifying key individuals, events, and places, many of them local New York places, in fact, that are mentioned in the text. So I'm going to talk at the end of tonight about the process that is involved in doing that. Let me just start here. I'm going to give you some context on the New York story, as well as kind of the global story of the Irish language. Of course, I would be remiss not to mention our partners, really, for this project that have enabled this to happen. The Robert D.L. Gardner Foundation, Glucksman Ireland House, the Insight Center for Data Analytics at University of Galway, and the Irish Institute of New York. So we're very grateful to the support that they have made available to allow this project to happen. So now let me set the context for you for how Brooklyn, of all places, came to be the home of an Irish language newspaper in 1881. So the first thing to know is that the Irish language by the second half of the 19th century was truly a global population in question here. By the end of the 1800s, something like about 4 out of every 10 speakers of Irish resided outside of Ireland, which is approximately about 400,000 individuals all told. About 1 in 3 of these Irish speakers were resident in the United States. And it's even further concentrated there in the sense that about half of these, a little bit more than half, a little bit more than half of that total, which is something about 250,000 or more, would have been resident in the Mid-Atlantic or New York area up into New England, right? So it tends to be pretty focused in our region, although not exclusively, as you'll see in the map in a moment. All of this info is based on the 1910 U.S. Census, which is the first to ask of respondents not only if they're foreign born, but what language they spoke as a mother tongue if they were born outside of the United States. I'll mention something about the 1920 census in a minute, but just know that it sort of backs the 1910 findings, and I even suggest perhaps that the 1910 was an undercount in terms of Irish born with mother tongue of Irish language. All right, here's the distribution based on what the 1910 census offers us. So this is the percent of that total, which is, as I said, over 250,000. where they're resident. So you do see there are some virtually everywhere. Of course, some concentration in places like the Midwest and upper Midwest and in California. But the bulk, in fact, almost 18% really of that total are in New York State alone, Pennsylvania very strongly represented, and Massachusetts. If you break this down by cohorts, which is really the proper way to do it, because we are talking about the 1910 census, but we're interested in the story earlier on, and you go by decade of arrival, which was given in the 1910 census for those that were foreign-born. Here's the breakdown of that cohort. That would have been percent claiming Irish as a mother tongue. It's actually fairly steady from the 1850 onward, something around 12 to 13% in most cases. There is an indication that it would have been even higher in the pre-famine period, really, so in the 1830s. And this might have been a similar story in the 1820s as well. So if anything, it would have been even more the foreign-born Irish-born speakers of Irish language as a mother tongue would have been higher in those earlier years. But it remains consistently strong up into the early 20th century. It's precisely the period that we're talking about today with this newspaper. And then if we look at the distribution, I have the table here, and then I'll show you the map, which is always easier to visualize. But you can see that some of the more concentrated areas aren't necessarily central Manhattan or even actually in Brooklyn and Queens, despite the fact that that's really our story tonight, which is Brooklyn. But in many ways, they're following the track of the Irish in general in this area, which was, to some of the more outer areas by the early 20th century. So in some ways, you have to think about this as this is like an early 20th century story about a population that in some cases have been around since the 1830s, if they're older. So very strong in Westchester, Queens as well, and across the river in New Jersey. And there's another version of that. Okay. All right, so that gives you a sense of kind of the context here in which Micheál O'Loughlin and the newspaper take form. So now I'll turn it over to Deirdre to walk us through that story.
It has been a homecoming, really, to be back in Glucksman Ireland House, a place I visited many times over the years, and I'm delighted to call it a home for this year, working on this project with Nick. And what I'm going to try and do is maybe answer some of the questions of why Brooklyn specifically, maybe, and why a paper, and then why Logan, Micheál O'Loughlin, the editor that we'll be talking about. But the first person I want to talk about actually is Fionnuala Ilanagon. Fionnuala is now retired from teaching, but she has produced 3 books on the people we're talking about, starting with Micheál O'Loughlin agus An Gaodhal, published in 1990, all done in her own time, sterling research, when she might not have been able to come to America even, and was reliant on scholars here to facilitate her research from Ireland. But these books are still being cited as authorities on all of this, so I guess we're standing on the shoulders of giants from generation to generation, but you may be familiar with some of those, and the most recent one, Narog Idi of Machine-readable, that never left my mind, my memory, detailing all these lives. So with An Gaodhal, some of you may be able to see the inscription on the top saying, "Is Pauper ma seo go divan?" So the reader was very pleased with their investment of this monthly paper, and the lovely characteristic 19th century print technologies being used there, this of course being hand printed, but we'll come back to that. So another map as well, and we're going to zone in on Brooklyn. These are some of the addresses that are occurring in the paper and in the story, and I'm still adding to this map as we go along, but some of the locals will probably recognise the pockets of Irish settlement in particular, and this is over time as well, so sometimes they're moving out over the course of the 20th century into, as Brooklyn builds out across Long Island, and maybe to better housing later on. So The addresses are occurring in the paper itself, but also in any manuscript material that we can come across, or letters that are occurring in multiple collections here in the States and also back in Ireland. But of course, the numbers that Nick has shared with us, there's, trying to establish the numbers. It's interesting reading different sources. In advance of this, I was revisiting Ken Nielsen's research, and he had a number for around maybe 80,000 Irish speakers in New York. Now, whether he meant city or state, I need to dig a little more to see. But there's no doubt but that Brooklyn having it's a bloom, in a sense, of Irish speakers suddenly appearing in this city, which by the end of the 19th century is the 4th largest in the whole of America as well. And we kind of forget that because, of course, it was consolidated with New York itself. And, for us growing up in Ireland, we don't hear necessarily about Brooklyn, except that it's part of New York in a sense. But locally here, of course, it's a very different story. Brooklyn has a very proud identity and independence and its own history, and we're making a case for it here even this evening. So the texture of life there, we're familiar with the hardships endured by people coming wave upon wave of immigration, and I guess we have a critical mass of Irish speakers among these Irish immigrants coming in, and they're a community, there's enough of them there, we'd say, but also they have things to say or ideas to discuss. They're dealing with discrimination, maybe they're enduring it, or maybe they're actually perpetrating it at times, and so there's lots of topical discussion in the paper, and that's where these discussions are happening in the 19th century, is in papers. And so we have a lovely image here. It's an illustration from this book by George Birmingham, but the illustrations are by Jack B. Yeats. And for the chapter entitled The Exile from Erin, we have this unmistakable scene of high-rise buildings and a view from inside a high-rise building. This is definitely America, not England, for instance. And what's the texture of life there? You've got postcards and letters connecting with home, and newspapers looking for news here where I am, but also maybe subscribing for materials that are back at home. And so you've got a critical mass, you've got people that are engaged politically in every other way, and they've got the newspapers to enable that engagement. So what form does it take? It starts with columns in otherwise English language newspapers, but maybe they get a couple of inches, column inches, for the Irish language. The very first of these is a New York paper, the Irish American, and the paper was founded in 1849, but the first Irish language column appears in 1857. And shortly after, not to be outdone, The Nation in Dublin has its own Irish column. And we start to see this sort of almost a tennis match between what's happening in America and what's happening at home in Ireland. Very much a transatlantic live conversation happening all of the time. A little bit later for the West, the Tuam News is significant because of the content, a lot of folkloric content there, also because of its sustaining over time. The same editor, John Glynn, editing that column for 20 years, and those manuscripts surviving in the National Library as happens. So one more thing to note here, of course, is the question of type. On the left, you can see the Cló Gaelach. On the right, it's Irish, but it's typed in the Roman lettering. So that's a key question for them at the time, and for us, as you can imagine, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But this is the first time that Logan appears in this milieu. He arrives in America in late 1871, and within months, he's writing to the Irish world, and he's talking about the Irish language. He wants to see a series of lessons in print, in the papers. You can't get books all that easily in Irish. So they're reliant on newspapers as providing reading material. He's talking about having an Irish class in every Irish society room in the Union. 60 or more could receive lessons at the same time. So a scale of ambition there, but also commitment, because he's volunteering to give lessons gratis in Brooklyn. So this is from 1872, and saying they would hear the pronunciation, which is the most difficult, in its native purity. So maybe questions around standard arising there as well, and those are current in the discussions in the paper. So what might those classes look like? Well, here is Logan again, writing to his local newspaper in Brooklyn, the Eagle, and there was an Irish editor in the Eagle at the time, Thomas Kinsella from Wexford. But interesting to note, we've got the address here on Fulton Street, 363 or 365, and he says, where you may see the sign on the door, the Philo-Celtic Society, a branch of the Dublin Society for the Preservation of the Irish Language. So the societies are going to play a role here, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But to think as well, who's attending the classes? Well, here's a letter from a child or a young person, and she's talking about attending the Gaelic school in Brooklyn. And she says, we have been going to the Gaelic school more than a year, and next week we're going to have the election of officers, and I suppose we will have a little entertainment. I'm going to write the Star-Spangled Banner now on a separate piece of paper. She means As Gaeilge. She wants to submit that to the paper to see it in print, the excitement of it. So all ages possibly, and maybe second generation attending Irish classes. So the classes are enabling literacy to emerge in this population, because of course many of them won't have had literacy in Irish, or any literacy in fact, upon arriving in America. But it's the societies, these Philo-Celtic societies, that enable the occasions and the events to gather and convene for lessons or the entertainments, as Lillian said. And so the very first of these was founded in Boston in 1873, and there's one in Brooklyn by 1874. And just note the rapid development of all of these. It's within a few short years. So everything is moving really rapidly. The role of the Philo-Celtic societies in the history of the Irish language, they're a key precursor for the Gaelic League. Douglas Hyde visits here in 1891, is impressed by what they've achieved, but also remarks on the challenges they've faced, maybe some of the disputes or the disunity that has arisen as well. And so that informs the approach that they take with forming the Gaelic League in 1893 in Dublin. And then soon after, there's a Gaelic League of America back here, and who's the president? Michael Logan, after a long career in editing and advocating for the language. So there's just an example of some of the minute books. They don't often survive, but the one for Pennsylvania does. And so comes the paper, 1881. So he's, within 10 years of arriving in the States, he's establishing this paper. The Philo-Celtic Society in Brooklyn is sort of the enabling body for it. But this is all Logan's project. At the start, they're going to commercial printers, maybe for the first 2-3 editions, but they're losing money because it's early days, and so he decides to save the venture to take on the printing himself. Now, it would appear that he is self-taught in printing, but we're still trying to get to the bottom of that, because he had a son whose own son, both of them, went on to become printers later. So it's an interesting question to think of how they were able to access that trade. But there were lots of printers around, compositors. Those who printed the 1916 proclamation were from the print trade themselves, so we shouldn't be surprised at that connection. And so what's driving him to do this? He's saying, well, no old Gaelic matter should be left unpublished. It's providing material printed as Gaeilge for this community, that the language might grow and thrive. And he very much sees that speakers in America can be part of that. In fact, he's adamant that they ought to be doing everything that they can. So very convinced of the difference that can make. He had supporters in this. Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, very early on, in his own paper, the United Irishman, had advocated and said to readers of that paper, you should be subscribing to An Gaodhal. And that call was heeded to the tune of 300 subscriptions straight away. So the subscriptions grew to 3,000, which was far more than was achieved by Idir an Gaeilge, for instance, in Dublin. And we can trace some of those subscribers both in the paper and in other manuscript material as occurs now and then. And so the readers, it's important to think of the readers. And there's an extract here of a man who was living in Philadelphia, and he talks about working 12-hour days, commuting for an hour each day, working nights, and when he wakes up in the morning, the first thing he does before going to work is working on the Gaelic manuscripts that he has, or reading the Gaelic newspapers, and then posting it home to Ireland to a friend at home. So they're being distributed as well. And then what's in them? Well, all sorts of opinion, I would say, but Logan's own politics are going to come out in it as well. But an example here of the Star Spangled Banner, famously translated into Gaeilge by An Gaodhal. And we've got, what else have I got here? Yes, I wanted to show you Idish Down the Gaeilge that followed, because it comes out in 1882, so within a few months of An Gaodhal appearing. They are different in quality. Idish Down the Gaeilge might have been more scholarly sometimes, but Logan is about connecting with the public and a reading public. So maybe he's more Catholic, I suppose, in including the content that he has. But interesting to think that the first night that An Gaodhal spent in America, he came to America because he was suffering from TB, and arrived in New York, and he stayed with Mícheál Logan in Brooklyn. Mentioned here in the paper, O'Growney at the time was professor of Irish at Maynooth, and of course he died in America, and famously was exhumed and had several burials en route back home to Ireland. So this key question of which type to use was very important, and Logan frequently made a case for using the Gaelic type, or Cló Gaelach. He had a whole article here explaining on why it was his choice. Some of that was to do with that Irish should be as separate as possible from English, but here he even made an economic case, saying, if you're using the bualte, the dots over the consonants, you're saving a lot of H's, and he had calculated, if you took out all those H's, how much space you would have on the page, down to the dollar, what it would cost over time. So extraordinary levels of sort of rhetoric there to achieve his own aim. And the challenges, they reoccur again and again in the paper. This is a little bit later, 1892, and the type that he's using is becoming worn. And so the challenge of even procuring type as well. There were the type used in An Gaodhal. We understand that it was cast in America, and because there are no examples of the type appearing in any of the print material that was produced in Ireland. So that's the logic behind that reckoning. And so trying to figure out where the type came from, where the type went, because type was precious. It was an asset if you had it, so long as you hadn't worn it out. So it's interesting to trace that material history. And just to give you a sense of, just to come back to that point of him printing this at home, this must have absolutely dominated the household. He had 5 children, and as I say, the youngest of them was the one who became the printer, Edward. So I can imagine here you've got the young assistant, smaller fingers to help with that tiny little type, and hopefully avoid errors as well along the way. So trying to trace that material history is significant as well, I think. So some more allies as well. This fabulous photograph here of Captain Thomas Norris, Kerryman, contemporary of Mícheál Logan, and supporter all along. And what you start to see is this generation, they die all around the same time, really rapidly. So one year after another, they're each going right around the turn of the 20th century, and it's a big shift in this whole story then what happens thereafter. Another person, we have Patrick Haverty, whose daughter took over the editorship when Logan died. Logan died suddenly in January 1899, and there's a January issue, and then there's a March issue, and from March onwards it's a very different paper. But Haverty was well, many things. Major Patrick Harvey served in the US Civil War, just like Norris did, and an Irishman and his children born in New Jersey, but ended up living in Manhattan, which is where he was when he died. But he had his offices down in, Printing, Publishing Row, all downtown, where all those printers were based. So the look even of the subsequent editions of An Gaodhal is very different. This is Celtic Revival, Yeats, Sing, all of that milieu, not as much Irish material. It shrinks enormously down to a max of about 4 pages, and reliant on Irish speakers to produce those as well. So the content declines considerably. And but today, actually, I found this in the New York Public Library, which is a little supplement, because I went to look at the physical copies of An Gaodhal that are in the library, and I'm not sure this has been digitized. So it's actually the musical setting for the Star Spangled Banner as Gaeilge. So if anybody wants a little recording project, off with you there with your piano accompaniment. But this is great to have, because for the lyric setting, where the emphasis is for "Oh, say, can you see?" where the Gaeilge version of that, how it should be sung. So, why Logan? Why did he, of all people, take this on? And this is sort of my last little bit before I hand back to Nick again. He was born in the County Galway, North County Galway, close to the Mayo border, significantly in the Tuam diocese. So if you know your Irish 19th century history, the Lion of the West, Archbishop McHale, in the 1830s, when the National School Act was enacted, McHale resisted this because he was afraid of losing control of the schools, because with the national schools, they were going to be non-denominational. So for a period of 10 years at least, Tuam, I suppose, was enabled in a way that other dioceses weren't, to maybe deviate, or the teachers would have that option. Now, the subjects were weighted back then. Some subjects were worth more to teachers to teach, and Irish certainly was not top of the list. So those who come out of Ireland with literacy in Irish, they are sort of uncommon, and it's interesting to trace where they might be emerging. So I've been gradually building up a map of some of the maybe collectors or scribes of the 19th century, and interesting to see just how many of them have come out of the Tuam diocese. So it's an avenue of research for anybody here who wants to explore it. Not an easy one to have to go through all those school records and find out, but certainly would be interesting to find out. But there's no evidence to say that Logan went to Jarlath's, for instance. We might imagine that he did. Ulick Burke, who of course was central to the history of St. Jarlath's and Tuam, they're contemporaries actually. There was a suggestion at one point that maybe that Ulick was teaching Logan, but I think the dates just weren't working out really for that to make sense. But certainly Logan references Burke's publications. So some of this is political, some of it is about creating the resources that they're looking for Irish. So Currachadere, it's an older brother, Patrick, who inherits the land, or rather the holding, we should say, because of course they're tenants. And they're surviving the famine in this area, though when we look at the genealogy of the family tree, there were evictions on both sides of the family. So he would have witnessed evictions before he left home. So the question for us was, for a long time, there's been a big question mark over what Logan was doing before he came to America. So I have a scoop for you this evening. And we've saved the scoop especially for our New York audience this evening. And the scoop is, can anybody guess? Okay, he was in the RIC for 18 years. But let's have a look. He is down as Logan, Loughan, so that's not Logan. I mean, we know that sometimes the names change a little bit. We've got the record here. He was, it suggests he's born around 1833, a little bit earlier, that he was recommended to the RIC by a man serving in Dunmore West, so Dunmore is very close to Milltown, and to join up, and he joins up in 1851, and he is sent to Meath, to Kells. And when he's in Kells, he meets a lady lady there marries her, their firstborn is baptised in Kells, but the rules in the RIC are husband and wife are not allowed to be based in their native counties. They must move. It's a bit cruel. So they send them to the Carlow-Laois border, south, and there's more children born down there. But something happens. And we're very fortunate that the records survived. He was dismissed, no pension, nowhere else to go, and we're lucky that we actually know why. He was a whistleblower. He was writing anonymous letters reflecting on the conduct of his officers. But he fell foul of his superiors, and where else could he go? He can't go home. And so this happens, it's September 1871 is when he's dismissed, and by the end of the year, he's in Brooklyn. So remarkable to have this piece of evidence here, and this adds enormously to our sense of his tone in his editing, the kind of moral tone, talking of honour and of commitment, because he paid dearly for his own integrity. And so it's something that is shedding enormous light for us on all the text that we're working with. Now we're at the point where we've managed to digitize the paper, and the exciting thing is now, what can we do next with it, now that it's in a digital format? And at this point, Nick is going to take over.
So for a discussion here of the technical details of what we're doing, I'm going to give you an overview, but I should preface this overview by saying it's, in some ways we're doing something that's been done many times before, which is have a computer read text. Everybody's phone does this right now, like OCR, optical character recognition, whereby particularly handwritten text, but also printed text, are transferred into something that a computer can work with, is ubiquitous in, today. So when we're talking about computers able to do this, they use machine learning generally to do that. That's not something that's particularly new, but it is getting better every year, and we're able to kind of respond to that and utilize that to greater effect. The other piece of this, though, is that there are very few training sets, and I'm going to talk about what I mean by a training set in a moment when we are in the context of optical character recognition. There are very few training sets for the Irish language, especially the older ones. There's a few older projects, if anybody here knows Kevin Scannell, and some of his students who've worked on this in the past. Those were there, but we wanted to do something that was a little bit more attuned to this specific print and this specific newspaper. So that's sort of the two new aspects that you would find in what we are doing today. So let me just give you a bird's eye view of what this entails. Recall, as Deirdre had showed you in those examples, we are generally dealing with a bilingual text. Sometimes, as you'll see in a moment in the close-up, not just bilingual from one part of, like one page to the other, but even one side of a column might be in English and the other side a completely different article in Irish. But even within the same sentence or in the same line, there might be a mixture of both Irish and English. So the first thing we wanted to do was concentrate on a very good Irish language model trained on the script that we're talking about in this newspaper. So to do that, we kind of needed to get the English language components of the text out of the way. So we did this by doing a first pass using an Amazon Web Service OCR program called Textract, which I'd used before and knew was very good at segmenting the text on the page. Again, I'll get into what I mean by segmenting in a moment. So this was meant to identify accurately the English language components, which we then looked at and said, are they more or less correct? We used the dictionary, not literally, it's a dictionary uploaded into the computer, and said, give me the lines that tended to check out. Most of the time they have proper English language words in them. Those we're going to identify as English, and then we're going to mask them. So we did an overlay that masked those from the subsequent training that we would do. That enabled us to train an Irish-only model on that Sean Clo, And then we randomly selected about, we started with 50, and then we would kind of up it as we found our performance needed to be improved. So we ended up with about 57 pages, which we transcribed by hand from the start. So no starter there. We had to do it from scratch. From there, then, we could do a second random selection of a new set of pages, and then use our Irish-only model to recognize as much of that as possible, then mix in some English pages, English language pages, use the software that we are utilizing for this process, Transcribus, to recognize the English language items, and then just correct the ones where you have sort of neither are working, right? Because there's a full bilingual mix in there. And that allowed us to train a fully bilingual model, something that can recognize both Irish and English. The last step, which we are poised to do in the next couple weeks, is to run that model now on the full, almost 3,000 pages of this newspaper that we have. All right, so let me talk a bit about some of those challenges inherent in that process I just mentioned, and then give you a sense of what OCR involves. So as you can see, we have these examples with Irish mixed into English on the left-hand side, into the Irish, and then on the right, some English that's mixed into a largely Irish passage. And again, as soon as we think we have something solved, you find little annoyances. So here, An Gaodhal is in Roman script, mixed in with the English. Down here on Loyal shows up. Why not set it in the Shan-Clo? Logan, has all the options in the world at his home press to make this as difficult for us in the future. So the masking, which I mentioned, this is the output from Amazon Textract. So you can see what we said is, okay, here's the text. We're not going to mask that. That's probably Irish that the English language OCR is failing on, whereas there, that all checks out against our dictionary. We're going to mask that for our next step. Here's what the masked page looks like. The masks here, right, that cover up most of the English. Every once in a while, you would get some that peeks through. We're not worried about that. We just ignored that. You pull the baseline detection off of it, and you don't send that to training. And then you can see kind of the color lines here. That's the computer in the first pass doing the layout recognition, where it looks for the text on the page. And then, of course, Deirdre and I doing our transcription on the right, of just the Irish language portion. All right, so that's the training step that has to go on. All right, more fun with trying to figure out Shan-Clo for computers. For us, this is not a problem, right? Guess the word. What word is this? Anybody? Soch, right? In the old Irish, Shan-Clo with the silent TH, or the T punctum in the middle. The old Irish scholars are like, oh yeah, this is quite remedial, all these extra letters that we normally wouldn't see. So yes, so this is Soch, as you can see, modern Irish on the right. But we have typeface challenges, all right? So the T, for example, will look a lot like a C, especially if there are any irregularities in how it was printed. R's and S's are notoriously, probably even for humans sometimes, let alone for the computer. So we have this example of near scorche, with as many R's and S's as you could possibly fit, and even an N to throw in there. All right, so overview of OCR just in a nutshell for fun. So we know that this isn't a black box, and computers are actually doing something that we can recognize. What does OCR involve, at least for these type of systems? One is to find the text, and they often do this by over-pixelating the black text on the page in black. So it looks something like that. That's my rough rendition of it. As you thicken those letters, they start to bleed into each other, and it becomes a very clearly delineated sense of that is the text, not page. Sometimes they'll add a binarization of the page so that the gray, brownish page becomes completely white, and any text pixels are heightened to become very black so that you can locate those. So 0 or 1 is essentially what the pixel colors we're looking for. From that, they can find baselines and start segmenting the characters. So I drew my little red boxes. So you can think we're basically trying to isolate characters. And then in the machine learning part, what they do is they'll grid each character, the computer will, and then it passes a filter over it that's kind of, it can be multiple types of filters, but as the filter passes over the character in turn, it's kind of picking out and heightening certain pixels that are what it thinks might be the essential features of that character, what we would call the extracted features. Or in, again, unsupervised machine learning, the feature map, the essentials of that particular letter, which it can then turn into zeros and ones, like pixel here, not a pixel here, pixel here, not a pixel here, in these vectors, as you see in the far right, of these representations. It's representing image as zeros and ones. All right, so we've told it that that set of zeros and ones is the letter D, right? The letter D in Latin character version of the Shanklo. And it's just going to keep running that, running those filters, looking at the answer that we have given it and seeing, is it correct? And over many, many passes, so we're talking so many passes that even a powerful computer will take up to 4 or 5 days to do it, they will start to be able to predict what the 0-1 pattern is that is associated with that character. All right, so we don't have to tell it what the features of that character are in current OCR technology. In the old days, they would try to guess based on segment versions of the character and all that. Now it's all about what we call unsupervised learning. The computer itself decides what's important about that character. Lastly, there's a validation step. So when it's doing this training, it holds back roughly 5 to 10% of all the training data we have given it, and then it checks it in its answers. That is the error rate that you want to know to see if your model is ready to go. Okay. So our current results are really good, all right? And I mentioned we're using Transcribus. This is a relatively new software. It's been produced by a Dutch company. We're seeing it pop up in all sorts of OCR projects at the moment. We're really impressed with it. Like, I was ready to give it a try. I've used other OCR software. One of our projects actually wrote one from scratch. It was like insane, right? There's too much work to do when you have something as good as this one, and it's working quite well. So we'll see how it does when it handles the full corpus of, like I said, almost 3,000 pages. But right now, it's doing well. Now, that's 98% accuracy on, again, that validation data. You'll always have slightly worse results when you go to the live version, and that's what we'll have to account for at the end of the day. Because you'll always, no matter how good now the computer is good at picking out the perfect R or the perfect S, you're going to have things like worn type, insufficient ink, or, a lot of fun, if you look really closely here, Logan or his child, we don't know, is swapping in Latin letters or Roman script in mid-word, right, in some of the Shanklo.
They ran out of A's.
Yeah, they ran out of A's is what we think is the story here. So, bilingual model, hopefully this will catch all of these things and we'll be set to go. So, all right, we have one last little treat for you, Deirdre, that I think gives us a nice, good alternative for understanding this community at this time. So.
So we've been thinking about the legacy of this paper. We've just seen what it is for us in the 21st century. But it's interesting to think about the generations that lived with this paper, that produced it, and those that followed them as well, and what their commitment to the Irish language meant for every generation since. I'm filled with admiration for their commitment, considering everything they'd been through. People that survived famine, and then all the hardships here in America as well, where it was really, sink or swim. And thinking about what happened afterwards. As I mentioned, Logan died 1899, Norris 1900, Haverty 1901. 1902, there's a big split in the Brooklyn Philo-Celtic Society. The split, of course, is classic in Irish politics. So, but there was a legacy that was maintained, but it's not something that's been mapped all that well. But we do have a lovely little item from the audio archives. And this is an interview with a man born in Brooklyn who was a fluent Irish speaker. So he's born in 1903, and his name is Joseph David, or Joseph Davitt. And many years later, his son donated his father's library to the Royal Irish Academy. So there's hundreds of books in the Royal Irish Academy, and those were used, in fact, for a lot of the digitisation projects that happened subsequently there. So really interesting to see this come around, not just full circle, but back around again. The cycle continues, as we saw in the 19th century, still down to our own time. And so I've got a picture of Pádraig Fertsair up here because David met him in New York, and remembered speaking Irish with him, and Fertsair praising this young Brooklyn lad for coming in and speaking Irish so fluently when he met him in the Irish shop here in Manhattan. So I'm going to play you a little clip of the interview, which was done for Radio An Gaodhal in the early 70s, shortly before Joseph died, and it's a lovely little story about how he met his wife. So Joseph David was teaching Irish in Brooklyn. And I haven't got a translation here, so I'll just give you a quick synopsis, and then the Gaelgody here can understand and share the jokes with everybody else afterwards. But the story is that Joseph was teaching Irish in Brooklyn. He started learning when he was 15, so that's 1918 or so. So by the 1920s, he's teaching. And so he's running a class. He says an older woman and a daughter or a niece or somebody came into the class, and the older woman came and spoke Irish with him. So maybe she's first generation. And she invites him home for tea. And from that, he meets his wife. So let's see if I can play it here for you.
Agus bíag rang an gaige chun síon fá.
Bhí rang an gaige agus rééis nó a bhí sé fámtaí gata go maidir. Ba bhí chuirte caiar mar ball ceach ar óla mé an teanga maidir. Bhfuil cíbal amar mé dhéana staidir a ré. Tháinig bean agus bhachaíon óga seach go rang ihe. Agus híidir a seach mar rang sé go tú. Bhí me móna héad rang maidir a sanam. Agus híidir a seach sa rang agus hasan an tean bean Lord Gaelglam, agus an sin nuair a bhín ranghat, ó si chuann an tígam mar le copan té, agus ó mé go teacha chuir nuair a ranghat, agus bin ó ar casa a bhanaram. Agus Gaelga bhí ag an máthar agus ag an áthir, an bhfuil teachas as Connemara, agus Gaelga amachcha, agus gleor scéalt ag an seanar person ag an áthir. Agus thug sin gheista maidir a bh Lord Gaelga, nuair a bhín cuairteach le bhana, I mean, you know, studied in a impression and I thought you know all of my job. But the federation got bloody, you know, we mission on the area of Malasham. Actually, I hear from one of blast on a matter, but my shit or a
Sí, bailí.
I want to blast on a matter, but I guess in the Asian, we have got a care, they got such a legacy, Linear Scala, as kind of a cost of them. August and January Tamalon. A column of Goyer near some in all of the Shinach, fair or way give you an fair in a hinder 100 year, my dear one. The channel Mach, recession and a honey song in America. I was Hushe skull at one, skull going, my dear one. I guess she the daily views skull, column my hand. I guess Seamus Macanyamara, Shinafara shape, Claudia Connemara, Seamus calling me Seamus Mohodish Middle. I guess Seamus on Lone. Sin dúthg a fáracha don lena bhí agarthir misneach chadó seo. Agus táhaí góra, agus mé héin, bhí mé héin marún ar an scoil. Agus bhíoh me dolig a móna gaige, an trúr colm Seamus agus Seamus a dónán a móna na rangarí.
Cadín líní sin?
Bhí sé sin, nígé dégus géan 48.
Very old style way of saying Lídeag 1928 when Joseph was teaching with Colm O'Gara, who was fleeing Ireland, really having been involved in Republican activities there. So just thought we'd share that little glimpse from the Radio An Gaodhal archives, given they're celebrating their Jubilee, just finished celebrating their Jubilee. But I have a theory about who the interviewer was. But if anybody's interested, come and talk to me afterwards. But at this point, we'd like to say thank you very much to everybody for coming here this evening, and we're delighted to see what progress we make over the course of the year, and you all can help by telling everybody about it and spreading the word, because there's a lot of research still to be done, and I've been in New York for a week, and already I've had bits of seanachas and memory from the Irish community here, remembering tales from relatives going back to, in fact, going back to the 1880s. I had a conversation with somebody at lunchtime today. So talking about it as Gaeilge no as Fairla will help us as well. So we'll welcome your questions, and thank you for your attention. There's a roving mic, if anybody.
This is brilliant. Just great stuff. Where else are the copies? You mentioned Galway and NYPL. Are there other fugitive copies around, or are those the two repositories?
So there's a few surviving copies here and there scattered. It can be difficult to ascertain whether it's the Logan edition or Haverty's one. And oftentimes what librarians do is give both titles, I suppose, to enable the discoverability. So I'm in the habit of going to look at them to be sure. But the reason that they ended up in Galway, they went to Galway in 1924, so nearly 100 years ago. And Nick mentioned Father Dan Murphy. He was the librarian of the Philadelphia Philo-Celtic Society and a major collector of Seanadh song. And over the course of his life, was collecting and gathering them together, because he had been a subscriber and a contributor and understood its value, and also saw what might happen if he didn't set about collecting them. So we have Father Murphy to thank for that. And then because Thomas O'Malley, another collector and editor, was in Galway, Galway being the great white hope for the Irish language in the early years of the Irish Free State, it was an understandable decision on their parts to say, let's send it there. And he'd kind of finished with it by then. So that's why they're in Galway.
Cogardachas ó Críoh écht gandát ó Hav Cursí Tangan agus Technoliaachta. I mean, this is such an achievement in terms of language and technology, and I'm already buzzing about the kind of questions that the resource will enable. One that comes to mind is the situation of a bilingual paper here, and I'm wondering, is there any evidence in the text of the founders keeping an eye on bilingual communities elsewhere in Brooklyn? You know, are they inspired by other language communities? Yeah. Logan references those, and in fact, there's a list of all the newspapers published in other languages as an effort to say, come on, we should be as good as any of these. Look at what the Chinese are achieving, and etc. So, he is looking at that.
Deirdre and I have been kind of talking about this issue as well, because we sense the frustration sometimes in these publications, this one as well as the other ones that include the Irish language column, that they're not further, the ball isn't further down the court, you know, in comparison to these other foreign, you know, non-English language press newspapers. And of course, the other thing that this is peppered with is lessons to learn Irish, effectively to learn how to read it, right, which you need for the newspaper. And so, whereas these other newspapers are already, you know, fully published in these languages, they don't have to worry as much about this. Here's one that, in some ways, is kind of stuck on the literacy problem, and hence some of the kind of very tense words sometimes in this newspaper. Yeah.
There's a lovely little story, Margaret, about a man who sent a letter in to Logan to ideally have it published in the paper. And he said, this is the first letter I've written in Irish, and sending it in for that reason. And he says, but look, if, after you publish it, please send it back to me, because it's the first letter I ever wrote in Irish. So he still wants to have it, to see it in print, but also have it. So the excitement of becoming literate, maybe literate at all, but certainly literate in Irish, is palpable.
Hello, I visited Micheál Logan's gravesite in Brooklyn at Holy Cross. What surprised me, it was very well maintained. There's a new brown granite headstone. It's considerably recent. Have you been able to make any contact with his descendants or his family? And would they have any stories or even hard material?
So, not yet. I got as far as tracing graves of descendants, somebody who had passed away in 1980.
Okay.
So it takes time, I suppose, to trace that. But it's nice to hear. Because I've just seen a photo that was put up on findagrave.com, but I don't know if there's been additional work as you
I'll
saw.
share it with you before I leave.
Oh, great,
I
thank
have
you.
it on my phone, actually.
Yeah, so we're working on it. We would like
And
to.
I'm glad someone asked the other question about had there been any observation of other language communities. Was there any real interchange, any real discussion with the other language communities in New York? And were there any observations of the American Irish language community by Kuno Meyer or other philologists at all?
Do you mean people not involved in it, like from outside looking in?
Yeah, that's right. People looking in, and maybe even people from inside looking out as well. Was there any contact or observation?
I'd say probably in the transatlantic setting,
Okay.
really, because the conversation is going over and back all of the time. But when you mention the likes of Kuno Meyer and those, of course, in Ireland, they are seeing some of the European influence coming there. And I mean, how many of those managed to come across the Atlantic? So I guess we need more scholarship on what was happening here to get a better sense of the question that you're asking. There's a lot that we don't know about the extent of the work here. I mean, what I'm sharing here a lot of the time is raw archival materials. I mean, I want to give a shout out as well to Matthew Knight in the University of South Florida, in the libraries down there. He's working on a book based on his PhD research on the Irish American, the first paper that had a Gaelic column, and he's been looking at the different Gaelic columns and that whole milieu as well, and absolutely fascinating to get that level of detail, but not as so many people that have spent that much time with it to be able to answer those kinds of questions just yet.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And the question is, how do we preserve the wonderful sense of humor and all the know-how and life that the Irish people have come along, pass it to the new generation who do not speak the Irish?
Well, I guess Logan's answer would be to teach it. But maybe you could talk about the scope for translation. Actually, might be interesting. The way that this, by extracting text, what you can do with the text you've extracted.
Yeah, that was the one thing we hadn't. We're still in the process of discussing what to do. So you get this base text here, but it can become a teaching tool, and it definitely can be used to heighten the visibility of this community. Not just that it exists still today, but that it has antecedents going back over 100 years. But there's all sorts of fascinating questions that come up with this, right? Which is, how do you rent a text like this for the computer, right? A digital edition that's based out of that